Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure for me to be here with you in Warsaw. In fact, I haven't been in Warsaw actually for 10 years, and things really have changed, so it's a great pleasure to be back. I want to talk today about the topic of active labour market policies for older workers, since this is often a mantra that's used in order to improve their employability. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to have a presentation in 3 parts. I just want to show you some stylized facts about what's been happening to older workers on the labour market in OECD countries. I'll say a few words about how Poland compares with other OECD countries. I'll keep it mercifully short for the Polish audience because they'll know all this, but some of the visitors may be as surprised as I was occasionally. And then I want to finish with really what does the evaluation literature tell us about the effectiveness of active labour market policies for older workers. So in terms of the stylized facts, there's some good news, and later I'll get to some perhaps not so good or bad news. The good news really is that older worker employment rates have increased in almost all OECD countries over the past 2 decades. And this really has to be good news in terms of the kind of pessimism that was the norm of the day in the 1980s and 1990s about increasing employment rates for older workers. And as you can see, there have been very, very few exceptions to this trend of rising employment rates among older workers. The second piece of good news is that the trend increase in employment for older workers was not interrupted by the Great Recession of 2008-2009. It's really striking that only 6 OECD countries have recorded a fall in older worker employment rates since 2007, and 4 of these countries, of course, are the peripheral Eurozone countries, which suffered the largest recessions. So it's perhaps not surprising that a country like Greece or Ireland or Portugal and Spain recorded falling older worker employment rates. It's also interesting to note that the average effective age of retirement for men in OECD countries rose by 1 year between 2000 and 2012, after having fallen significantly over the 2 previous decades, and there was a similar increase for women, which was even larger in the more recent period. So that's all good news. Second aspect that I think it's important to note is that the rising trend in older worker employment rates in almost all countries did not come at the expense of worsening employment prospects for young people. Those of you who are old enough in the audience, and that excludes most of you, by the way, will not remember that in the 1970s and 1980s, the lump of labor fallacy predominated, and there was a very strong move in many European countries to encourage early retirement among older workers on the grounds that it would provide more jobs for young people. Now we subsequently discovered what a fallacy that was, and it's very nice to see that, as I said, for those of you who want to see it in chapter and verse, last year's Employment Outlook has a very detailed and I think very nice, convincing cross-country study of this. Now there are 4 possible hypotheses which have been discussed in the literature to explain why older worker employment rates have been increasing. One is a cohort effect. I mean, the recent cohorts of older workers are better educated than the previous cohorts, and ceteris paribus, that should improve employment prospects. Second, and that's good news for all of us, particularly those of us who are older workers, is of course that health status on average is improving for us. A third is, of course, the reforms to pension systems and early retirement pathways that were mentioned in the previous session, with many of which have the explicit aim of promoting longer working lives. And then lastly, of course, wealth effects in those countries where private pensions are significant and where big hits were taken to private pension wealth as a result of the financial market collapses. Unfortunately, at the moment, we don't really dispose of a good cross-country study or set of studies which can disentangle the relative strengths of these different factors. And I've been pushing my colleagues at the OECD to do that as part of some work that they have underway. Now let's turn to the not so good or perhaps bad news. The trend increase in older worker employment rates is almost entirely due to increased retention with the same employer. There is unfortunately no evidence of an increase in hiring rates of older workers. And that has to be, I think, a rather negative and worrying factor. And even more worrying is that the evidence collected by the OECD shows that over the past almost 15 years, in which there's been that strong trend increase in older worker employment rates, and the aging of the population is proceeding at pace in many countries, there is still no sign of any increase in hiring rates for older workers. They remain extremely low in almost all countries, and there is no sign of any increase. So, I mean, one conclusion I think that we can draw from this is that ageism is alive and well in terms of the hiring decisions of employers, despite the almost universal adoption of anti-discrimination legislation, which includes age as an explicit factor in that legislation. And of course, for the bottom line of my story today, very low hiring rates for older workers do not bode well for very effective active labor market policies targeted to the older unemployed. Just a few quick words, and this is a bit of an eye test for you as well. Those of you who cannot read the figures, perhaps you don't really need to visit your optician, but maybe it might be advisable. Just a few words. First of all, employment rates for older workers have increased in Poland as elsewhere, but they still remain significantly below the European Union and OECD averages. And it's particularly interesting to note that while there has been some convergence between the employment rates of older workers in Poland and the EU averages, this convergence is entirely confined to workers aged under 60. For the age group over 60, there is no convergence. In fact, the gap has widened a bit. Some specificities about the Polish labor market for older workers. There's an extremely high incidence of temporary contracts. The incidence of temporary contracts for Polish workers is more than twice the average in the EU and OECD. The hiring rates for older workers in Poland are identical to the EU and OECD averages, but they've dropped actually since the beginning of the last decade. And I draw your attention to an interesting feature that maybe some of you are not so aware of, even among the Polish audience. The participation in training, particularly on-the-job training among Polish older workers, is extremely low. It's currently around about 2% on an annual revenue. That is 1/4 of the EU and OECD averages. So that has to be quite an interesting and worrying feature. Now, just a few quick words about active labor market policies, and as you all know, defined by the OECD and Eurostat. These are a range of measures that cover job search, assistance and counseling, subsidized employment in the private sector, public sector job creation, and subsidies for self-employment, entrepreneurship, business startups. They are relatively underdeveloped in Poland. If you look at the two indicators that the OECD uses for active labour market policies, that is the public spending effort as a percent of GDP, then it's only 0.4% of GDP, with an OECD average of almost 0.6, or twice that if you look at the EU average. And the proportion, again, of the labour force that participated on active labour market policies was, again, below average in Poland. Now, unfortunately, we don't know how much of the public spending on labour market policies is targeted to older workers, nor how many of those program participants were older workers. Let me now turn to what the literature tells us about how effective or not active labour market programs are for older workers. First thing to understand is, just to repeat the point I made a moment ago, there's a lack of active labour market data that is targeted to older workers. Secondly, unlike the case for young people, for which there exist many specific programs which are targeted to them, and for which there are many rigorous evaluations. And for example, if you look at the meta-analysis that was done by David Card, you will find that young people, the age group 15 to 64, is one of the categories that's distinguished separately, and for which you can look at the evidence coming through these meta-analyses. But there are no similar data, nor is it possible to disaggregate the evaluation studies in terms of meta-analysis by looking at the age group 55 and over. So that's a problem. So in order to try to overcome this, I've been doing a lot of reading of evaluation studies of one kind or the other. My former colleagues at the OECD, who are doing reviews of cross-country reviews of policies to foster the employability of older workers, have also very kindly dredged up a lot of studies that I've had a look at and so on. And my next few slides are really drawing on that, together with some other literature that I've looked at over the years. So what do we know about the effectiveness of these programs, with the specific focus on helping older unemployed workers find jobs? Well, I'll start out with what appears to be about the only piece of good news I was able to find, actually, in this review, and that is that enhanced job search assistance and counseling can work for older workers if it's conceived as part of an effective, what I call an effective activation strategy. That is a strategy which combines intensive counseling and job supports for older workers, together with an effective degree of monitoring and a threat effect, if you like, as evidenced by a well-designed benefit sanction policy that is appropriate and adapted to the case. And here, as I said, there are some evaluations from Flanders, from Denmark, from the Netherlands, Norway, and Switzerland, which bear this out. But three caveats, I would say. One is, and this again is a bit unfortunate, they only seem to work for the younger, older workers. That is the cohort age 50 to 55, or perhaps if you go a little bit more, perhaps we might squeeze it towards 57. Then there does appear to be some really positive effects in terms of increasing the exit rate from unemployment to jobs from these kinds of programs. But they do not work for the older unemployed. Second point is that these methods are costly. You require very intensive engagement with the older workers, both in terms of counseling, but also in terms of monitoring. So they're costly. So there is a question mark about the overall cost-benefit of some of these programs, which unfortunately many of the evaluation studies haven't yet fully tackled. And the third point is that for the older unemployed in these programs, there is clearly a tendency for them to exit from the program to another inactive benefit, with disability and long-term sickness often being the exit for many of the older unemployed from these programs. With regard to training programs, even what I regard as really well-designed training programs with a strong workplace component to them, unfortunately, again, these do not work for those aged over 55. And even for those aged between 50 and 55, many of the studies suggest that the returns are really not very, very large to the program participants. Public sector job creation programs do not work, period. They don't really work in general for most of the unemployed anyway, but they certainly do not work for older workers. Though, to be fair, there is some evidence from the qualitative evaluations that the older unemployed feel somewhat better and a bit more motivated after having participated in one of these programs. But in terms of improving their chances of exiting from the public sector job creation program to a regular job, the answer is they don't. Wage subsidies for employers to hire older workers can work. I mean, there is some evidence, but they are subject to large deadweight and substitution effects. So the net employment gains are generally quite small. And again, and this is the sad thing about it, I keep repeating myself, for those older unemployed, they do not. The employment effects are clearly zero, basically, I would say, the net employment effects from them. Subsidies for self-employment, entrepreneurship, and business startups, these are very popular. Some people think these should be well designed and well adapted to the case of the older unemployed, but that is not the case, frankly, when you look at the rigorous evaluations. I encourage you to look at the one in the United States for the GATE program, for example, which is a very nice experiment, well designed. What that shows is, of course, that there are some people among the unemployed who benefit from them, but they are typically the middle career workers and often well-educated mid-career workers or people who have been a long time as artisans. They are not the kind of programs that yield large benefits for the older unemployed, again. An interesting novel program which we at the OECD were very keen on is the idea of wage insurance programs for the older unemployed. Oh, sorry, I should hold on to the microphone, shouldn't I? This is a scheme that says that if you take a job that pays you significantly less than your previous job, you are given an earnings top-up, which can be limited in time, or even in the case of one or two of the schemes, could be essentially quasi-permanent. And there are some examples. One was as part of the Hartz reform, which was introduced in Germany in 2003 for job losers aged 50 and over. And there, the earnings top-up was essentially permanent. Another was in the United States as part of the change to trade adjustment assistance. They got something that was called adjusted trade adjustment assistance, I think that's right, in which you got an earnings top-up if you lost your job as a result of trade changes and you were aged over 50, and that earnings top-up lasted for 2 years. Now, this all sounds very, very nice. I mean, it seems to be an incentive to encourage older workers to have more realistic reservation wage expectations and also to exit more quickly, because exiting more quickly will get you a top-up. The unfortunate thing is that the take-up of these schemes was really low, both in Germany and in the United States, and indeed Germany abolished the scheme actually in 2011. as far as I can tell, I haven't yet been able to find some more detailed information. It seems that neither the unemployed nor the public employment service officers were that keen on the program or were that well informed about it, actually, so that many of the older unemployed in Germany who would have been eligible for the program didn't know about it. So there's an interesting question. But that's really a rather disappointing, I think, outcome for what, in principle, looks a rather promising innovation, particularly for the older unemployed, for whom, you know, the fear that you might have to accept a wage offer that is much below your previous wage is clearly a hindrance, especially if you have alternative opportunities to move on to other inactive benefits. So, let's come to the bottom line, as it were. I wish I could be more optimistic, actually, about the effectiveness of active labour market policies in their present state for improving the employment prospects of older workers. Unfortunately, the best that you can take is they really don't work very, very well for older workers. Indeed, it's a little bit like the old Heckman story, you know. That is only early interventions in this area, particularly in childhood and going up to, shall we say, 2025 really work. I mean, Jim, if he was standing in my place, would say, why are you talking about all this? Because it's well known that it will be totally ineffective anyway. Unfortunately, the evaluation evidence such as we have does by and large, I say by and large, I am not as extreme. I've never been extreme in anything as Jim Heckman is in everything on these matters. But it is disappointing, to put it mildly, that we seem to have so few examples of programs that work. Those that do work, as I said, I think it is possible to look at examples of enhanced job search assistance counseling as part of an activation strategy that will work, but the real thing to bear in mind is that they probably won't work well for the older unemployed. And that, I think, is unfortunately, I have to stop at this point, leaving you with such a rather negative judgment, but that's my reading of the literature. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.